Tonight's conversation will focus on how China or the Chinese leadership sees and understands the world and what we can learn from that. And of course, there's no one better suited to discuss this than Kevin Rudd. So Kevin, we're thrilled that you're with us here tonight. It's been a long time. Last time we were here was in 2018.
Wow, was it 18, wasn't it? I thought it was 19. Yeah.
I dare say the world has changed quite a bit since then. So it's good to have you back for an update on how things are. So before we get into it, it's really good to be back in Zurich. I always feel as if I'm sort of coming home here some way. It's a friendly town, and it's a beautiful town, and I enjoy this city a lot, and the work that the Asia Society is doing. We've been around as an institution for 65 years, and we now have centres around the world because we discover this growing global appetite to try and understand what the hell's going on. And particularly with China. So, Nico, you're leading a great centre here. And to our friends from Credit Suisse, thank you. And you'll get 10% of the sales of the book. One thing I'd love to start with is that you've been an observer of geopolitics for a long time, and I kind of assume that there's not a lot of things that surprise you anymore. But there's been quite a lot of things happening in recent months and years that took me by surprise, I think took a lot of us by surprise. So I'd love to hear to start is like, what surprised you recently? What was something that really took you by surprise that you did not expect happening?
I could say, having just come out of the Australian political environment, that my party finally won an election. That was
congratulations.
Thank you. So I've spent 5 weeks on the hustings kissing babies, and here's a message for Klaus Schwab, by the way. I reckon I shook 5,000 hands in Australia in the election. I didn't get COVID, yet everyone who went to Davos has got COVID, is that right? So, a serious answer to your question is not Ukraine, because I've become something of a student of Vladimir Putin since 2014. I've only met him a few times, but it did not surprise me. What has really surprised me, and it's geopolitics, and I suppose it's geoeconomics, is how China under Xi Jinping has actually quite profoundly changed the growth model within China itself and made it more statist, less friendly to the private sector, and as a result, causing a rapid slowdown in China's economic growth. And as someone who's looked at the Chinese economy for 40 years, this surprises me because it's something I didn't think that China would do. And the thing which may still surprise me is whether they correct it or whether they sustain the direction in which they've now taken, which is in a less growth-friendly direction.
Excellent. Well, I think that's something that we would have to invite you back in a few months or years to figure out whether it's happened. So we wanted to focus tonight's conversation on understanding how China sees the world, because I think that's something that we often maybe kind of overlook. But I want to start with a somewhat fundamental question. Given that there's an ever bigger divergence between China and the quote-unquote West, what's really the point of investing time and energy into understanding China's worldview? So obviously we have to concern ourselves with China. There's a competition going on, but does it really make sense to invest time into understanding how the Chinese leadership thinks instead of investing time into building out our own capacities, our own capabilities? It seems that's what China does. So what is the merit of trying to understand deeply the way you do how China thinks?
That's a good and provocative question, Nico, which is, Kevin, have you been wasting the last 40 years of your life?
Yes, that was the question.
Possibly.
I assumed you had an answer.
I think it's a bit like this. I think we're all required to walk and chew gum. The beginning of wisdom in politics, the beginning of wisdom in international politics, the beginning of wisdom in business, is to understand how the other person thinks, why they think they're that way, and what their priorities are, rather than commit the cardinal error, which many of our American friends still commit, which is to mirror image everything. That is to think that those you're dealing with will automatically reason in the same way in which you reason. So if you want for me to answer the question, why bother seeking to understand the Standing Committee, the Politburo, the Chinese Communist Party, China's political economy, Xi Jinping's worldview. It's because we need to constantly challenge ourselves as to how does the world look through the Beijing Politburo lens, and it does not necessarily accord with what we would assume about ourselves in a similar position. I think that's why we need to spend time. And the second part of your question was, at the same time, it's not just an idle academic reflection, because these are profound real-world changes now. And we've just been through a couple of hundred years where the Anglosphere, first the Brits, long may she reign, 70 years today, and then the Americans, sometime probably in the 30s, have effectively been the central powers underpinning the international system, probably since the Napoleonic Wars. Really? I think that's a fair summary. And this is of profound consequence, what's unfolding beneath our feet. If China does become the largest economy in the world, and we can come back to that question soon, given the challenges to the growth model which we've just discussed, if it does still become the largest economy in the world, it'll be the first time since George III was on the throne of England that a non-Western, non-English speaking, non-democratic country will be the largest economy in the world. And that's of profound significance. So therefore, understanding that and its consequences in terms of how we therefore acquire our own national capabilities in responding to that is, I think, of first order importance for everybody, whatever your form of professional life may be.
Excellent. Then I suggest we do exactly that tonight and try to understand how Chinese leadership sees the world. Last week, Asia Society and you back in the US hosted US Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who sort of gave his sort of defining speech on the US-China policy. And there's a line in the speech that I wanted to quote and then ask you about it. And the line is like this, and I quote, "Beijing's vision would move us away from the universal values that have sustained so much of the world's progress over the past 75 years. Let's put a pin into what universal values exactly are and what Tony Blinken means when he says that. Here's something that always trips me up, is that he refers to Beijing's vision. And it seems to me that over the last years, many people have written about China becoming more powerful, eventually overtaking the US, kind of ruling the world. And while that all may be true and may be happening, I have yet to hear, I think, sort of a convincing formulation of what Beijing's grander vision for the world that they're supposed to be ruling soon is. So beyond preservation of power and securing influence, is there a larger vision that the Chinese leadership under Xi Jinping has for the world as they would like to run it?
Yeah. Because I'm old-fashioned and Australian, I don't like seeing people stand up. So there are 5 seats down the front here. So
those are actually need to be blocked off for the cameras, I was told.
Oh, I'm sorry. You've got to stay where you are. I was going to try and find you somewhere to sit. So please don't worry about me. Just find somewhere to sit, because this will go on for a while, and I don't want people to be. So I don't care if you shuffle around and all the rest of it. I've just been kissing babies for 5 weeks. Nothing surprises me. So let's go to this question of what is the worldview? And I think that's probably the best term. What is China's worldview under Xi Jinping? I think there is an underpinning reason, Nico, why it's important to understand this, because China now has just celebrated the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Chinese Communist Party. It's been the ruling party in China since 1949. It is a Marxist-Leninist party which, in the year 2022, takes Marxist-Leninist ideology deadly seriously. So therefore, understanding concepts of worldview, the Chinese term is 世界观, worldview, is really important because it is the organizing principle within which reality is viewed. It may seem arcane for those of us in a post-communist, as it were, West. But in my attempt to understand the worldview, I've had to reread the ideological underpinnings of Xi Jinping's view of the world. And on that score, there has been no leader since Mao who has written so much on Marxism-Leninism than Xi Jinping. There are multiple texts out there which define his attachment to the ideology, and the fact that his analysis is that the collapse of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was because they went soft on ideology, and therefore the Chinese Communist Party should not face the same fate, and it must therefore begin with an ideological rebuilding of the party. So I think it's important we understand that. So take that as the premise. How do I summarize the actual worldview? And give me 3 or 4 minutes to do it, and then I'll promise to shut up. In the book, please buy a copy, I describe it as 10 concentric circles of interest. And these are really important, I think, for us all to understand. And I'll give 10 seconds on each. 1, keep the Leninist party in power at all costs. And keep me, Xi Jinping, as head of the party at all costs. Not as a transition point to some future slow evolution in the direction of a Singaporean-style democracy. That idea, which may have once existed, is no longer applicable. Number 2, national unity. That's how we maintain our legitimacy as a party. That means what we do in Xinjiang, what we do in Tibet, and what we're now doing in Hong Kong, and what we propose to do with Taiwan. Number 3, grow the economy. Interesting now. Living standards up, achieve political legitimacy, sustained basis with the Chinese people by continuing to have higher levels of disposable income, but also greater national economic power through which to fund other critical national capabilities, most particularly those of the military. 4, do so now in an environmentally sustainable fashion, because the Chinese people don't like dirty air, dirty water, and dirty soil, because they don't want to eat contaminated food products and die prematurely. It's a new factor in the hierarchy of needs. 5, modernise the Chinese military, in Xi Jinping's terms, to turn it into a modern, world-class military capable of fighting and winning wars, unquote. 6, China's 14 neighbouring states, 周边国家, the greatest number of neighbouring states of any country in the world apart from Russia, which also has 14, and have those relationships benign at a minimum and optimally compliant from Beijing's point of view, in order to have a reasonable cordon sanitaire around the country. Then 7, on your maritime periphery, that is facing to the east, and over time push the United States back in order to accommodate your eventual reunification with Taiwan. And that means doing what you can to undermine American alliance structures in Asia, with Japan, the Republic of Korea, and Australia in particular, but also Thailand and the Philippines. 8, there's only 3 to go. On the continental periphery, moving west, not east, use the Belt and Road Initiative to convert Eurasia into a zone of economic opportunity for Beijing, but also a zone of greater economic development, period, and a series of economies which become themselves increasingly dependent on China, extending across Eurasia, into South Asia, into the Middle East, eventually to Eastern Europe, 16+1, then to Western Europe. 9, in the rest of the developing world, Africa, Latin America, the rest of Asia, to become the indispensable economic partner of all, A, to expand your markets further, B, to develop those countries through their infrastructure, and then C, have them as reliable votes for China or international organisations, where the votes of all those countries matter. UN, Bretton Woods institutions, elsewhere. And then finally, on the international system itself, begin to change the nature of the international system in its institutional arrangements and values assumptions in a manner more compatible with China's worldview. And you see that already here in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, where China systematically, both in Geneva and New York, seeks with the support of Russia and others to begin to strip out the human rights provisions of various UN resolutions and to replace them with state sovereignty rather than the rights of the individual. And that being a harbinger of a change to institutional arrangements more generally. So I wish I could say all that in one sentence, but I can't. But if you think of it as a series of concentric circles, starting with party power, that is a view that I reflect in what I've written, but no Chinese interlocutor, when I've put this to them, has disagreed with me, though it will not be written as such in as clinical terms as I've just written in any Chinese source.
Thank you very much. This was fantastic and comprehensive. I was going to ask you a lot of questions about these 10 concentric circles. I can skip down quite a bit here in my notes and just move on. That's fantastic. So you've laid out this wonderful, astute summary of what the current worldview is and what these 10 concentric circles are. I want to go, before we talk about some of the circles a bit more, I want to ask about things that have changed. So this is the status quo that we're seeing right now, that we're observing right now, that it seems fairly stable, but have there been notable shifts in this in recent years? What are some of the things that have changed and were different than how you've been describing them before? You mentioned economic policy, of course, where there's been a notable shift. Are there other areas where you see sort of the Chinese worldview evolving?
The worldview I've just described is the Xi Jinping worldview, so I've seen that emerge since really 2013. And for my sins, in the think tank that I run in New York, I have to read all this stuff. And remember, the Chinese system, while opaque to the rest of the world, with a Communist Party with 95 million members, has to talk to itself as well. And the method of discourse internally within the party is often conducted ideologically. And so what I've just reflected is gleaned from the principles which are evident in China's internal literature, but not classified literature, with one or two exceptions. What's changed since he took office? The big one is what we've just touched on, and the surprising one for me is item 3, which is the model for economic development. There's an interesting question which arises from that. If you have had a successful economic model for 40 years, based essentially on this, labour-intensive manufacturing for export, plus increasing opportunities for the Chinese private sector against a retreating state-owned sector, plus decreased role for state planning, plus greater economic integration with the rest of the world, with both trade and investment flows, and integration with global supply chains, both inwards and outwards. And if that's produced for you double-digit growth for 40 years, then why would you change it? Not a bad question, even though I've just asked it myself.
Would you care to answer it as well?
Yeah, I'm going to try and answer it too. because I've tried to figure this out, which is why do that? Now, the economists will answer the question. You get to a point in the economic development cycle where you actually have to flip, and you have to move from labour-intensive manufacturing for export, for example, because unit labour costs go up, and as a consequence, models have to change. So they did this on paper in what's called the decision, the Jueding, of 2013. And this was 1 year into Xi Jinping's rule, where they identified a new economic growth model, but which was along these lines, which is Number one, greater productivity growth. Number two, an explosion in the Chinese services sector beyond manufacturing. Number three, on top of that, even greater space for the private sector based on the principles of competitive neutrality to occupy more of the space occupied by the Chinese state-owned sector. Four, less reliance on the infrastructure build in the country to generate growth, which had been another large part of the model phase one. And five, maximise your integration further with the global economy. So in other words, it was still within a market frame, not a statist frame. It was the next stage of, let's call, market economics, given the structure of the Chinese economy. So we all looked at that and we said, this is sensible, it's reformist. It will make China, by the end of the 2020s, the largest economy in the world. So why did they change? Politics. Because, remember I said before, it's a Marxist-Leninist party. If you apply a model like that over a long enough period of time, you create a whole bunch of new elites in the country who are independent of party control. The entrepreneurial class, typified by Jack Ma, the head of Alibaba, the larger-than-life Jack, I know him well, head of what was one of the largest companies in the world until the Chinese Communist Party killed the stock price. Xi Jinping looked at this long and hard and said, these guys are ultimately a challenge to the absolute control of the Chinese Communist Party. And as a consequence, if I look carefully at the ideological unfolding of Xi Jinping's last 5 years in office since 2017, coming out of the 19th Party Congress, you see this range of new measures which are much more restrictive towards the private sector. Party committees in private firms, the so-called mixed economy model, whereby you're a successful private firm, sir, you're running a state-owned enterprise, madam, I think we should merge you, which would, of course, make you unhappy and may make you happier. Or there's a non-performing state-owned enterprise over here, a brilliant private firm there. You can merge so that you can use your profitability to offset the losses of this state-owned behemoth. A new invigoration of industrial policy writ large, a new reinvigoration of planning writ large. And on top of that, again, certainly in the last year or two, what's called the Common Prosperity Agenda, 共同富裕, if you speak Chinese. And what that is code language for is wealth redistribution from the entrepreneurial class to workers. So all of that has been his ideological correction to bring about a more equal China in his ideological view, but frankly, to bring the entrepreneurial class under political control. That, I think, is the essence of the agenda.
And if we sort of try to reframe what you just said in terms of the concentric circles, is making changes to the third circle, if I remember correctly, economic policy, because it would serve achieving number 1 and 2.
Exactly, because 3 ultimately conflicts with 1.
Yeah.
And so, and whereas they sustained the ambiguity of that during Xi Jinping's first term, 2013 to 2017, the quote, to use a Chinese communist term, the contradictions, the 主要的矛盾, within the ideological framework of the party became too acute in Xi's analysis, and hence the adjustment back towards the party, back towards the state, back towards state-owned enterprises, and less accommodating of the Chinese private sector. Where all this rolls on to is the present, by the way, which is Chinese growth numbers right now, in the first 6 months of this year, because of the factors I've just described, plus zero COVID lockdown, are now bumping along the ground at somewhere between 0 and 2%. Now, this is unprecedented in post-92 Chinese economic history, but it's therefore creating a whole bunch of new tensions in central Chinese politics as we speak. But it is classically the clash between 3 and 1.
Mm-hmm. I think there would be a lot more to talk about here. I want to move on to a slightly different topic, which is how China exerts or tries to exert influence around the world to sort of share its worldview and promote it. You mentioned a few things before. You mentioned the Human Rights Council in Geneva, where that's visible. But to me, it seems when I look at China's initiatives to sort of influenced the world in recent years, honestly, most of them seem to have fallen flat. So the Belt and Road, which a few years ago was sort of hailed as this all-encompassing concept, I haven't heard from it recently. It's still there, I know, but it's not something that seems to be advertised ever so strongly from Beijing. We've read so much about Chinese tech companies, sort of taking over from Apple and Google and Microsoft, and honestly, many of them have been quite hampered by the restrictions that have been placed on them, mostly by the U.S. government. There is, it seems to me, very little Chinese soft power to speak of. In Europe, there was the 17+1 framework where China tried to sort of get the Eastern European countries on its side, and that seems to have failed. So, wouldn't we have to conclude that all these Chinese attempts to influence the world in its way and to make the world sort of come closer to China have actually failed?
As we say in the classics, yes and no. Let me give you the no first. And that is, what's China's global strategy? In a nutshell, in achieving many of the mission statements that we ran through before in the 10-part worldview, or at least the international dimensions of the 10-part worldview, are through China becoming the indispensable economic partner of us all. China is now, I think, Switzerland's third largest trading partner. It's Australia's largest trading partner. I mean, about 35% of Australian exports go to China. China, I think, is the largest trading partner of any significant economy in Asia. Became Germany's largest trading partner last year. So, the Chinese grand strategy, if I could put it in a nutshell, is to achieve 1 through 10 above without ever firing a shot anywhere, but by becoming the indispensable economic partner of us all, so that ultimately our national economic well-beings and by extension our corporate individual well-beings are dependent on our access to the Chinese market, access to the Chinese financial services market, in the case of Switzerland, the United States, and some of the Europeans, etc. Because that ultimately produces what is almost said explicitly in the Chinese internal literature, using, in Xi Jinping's term, the gravitational pull, quote unquote, of the Chinese economy to leverage foreign policy compliance from the rest of the world. And if you look at it, up until about 2017, this was going not too badly. China was not being, there was no, until that stage, not much by way of wolf warrior diplomacy, 战狼外交. There was a reasonably effective strategy around the world, and then with the 16+1 as well. As China with the BRI in infrastructure projects across many of the East Europeans, etc., was seen as increasingly the indispensable economic power, both in trade markets but also in capital markets, as it began to become a much larger player. So I think what's gone wrong from the Beijing perspective is classic overreach. That is, and this I think is Xi Jinping's core failure, is that he, from the internal critique within the Chinese system, has gone too far, too fast, too hard, too early. That is, rather than just waiting for these processes to take their natural course over time, in the tradition of Deng Xiaoping, which is always to kick the can down the road and to allow these things to evolve organically, having taken core decisions, which is to open the Chinese economy, grow it, and then just see what the hell happened after that. Wasn't a bad strategy when you think back on it. To one which says, oh, you're giving us some trouble, you're criticising our human rights performances in Xinjiang. Well, let me tell you what we're going to do to you. And so when I see the range of bilateral coercive measures against the Norwegians over the Nobel Prize, against the Swedes over the Swedish national has been incarcerated in China, the European Union over the sanctions placed on the members of the European Parliament who objected to Chinese human rights practices in Xinjiang, through to the Australians, the massive tariff impositions against probably a third of Australian exports to China, probably a $20 or $30 billion loss in Australian exports. So against the Republic of Korea over Korea's decision to deploy THAAD systems, that's theatre missile, anti-ballistic missile defence systems, targeted against North Korea, not against China. But the Chinese objected to it for their own strategic reasons. Then Kia and other Korean car sales plummeted in China by huge numbers. And so these patterns of coercive Chinese economic diplomacy and then direct wolf warrior diplomacy, which is Chinese ambassadors taking to the airwaves around the world and attacking various countries for doing X, Y, and Z, A, B, and C. This, I think, has been a reflection of the new line under Xi Jinping, and I would agree with you. It has not advanced China's interests. So therefore, when I say yes and no, yes, the strategy about being the indispensable economic partner of everybody continues. No, because there's been political overreach by the regime at the same time, and particularly in the last several years.
At the very beginning, when I asked, why should we even spend time to understand the Chinese worldview, you made a very compelling case, and you also said it's not just purely an intellectual exercise. This stuff matters. So I want to talk a bit about that as well. We've talked a bit about what the Chinese worldview is. Now let's talk about what we make out of these insights. How can a country like Switzerland, but also other European countries, other countries in general in the world, create effective China policies based on that understanding? And I always feel it's good to sort of look at good examples. So when we look around the world, and if you had to sort of rate different countries for their recent approaches to China, who's top of the class? So who's an example that you would point as like, this is a country that's done very, very well in engaging China in an effective, from the country's point of view, way? Which country is doing really, really well vis-a-vis China right now?
Well, let me use some criteria first, because rather than me just being subjective, let me try and give you an objective set of criteria in terms of who's done well and who's done less well. What are the criteria, in my perspective, of an effective China strategy, given all the constraints that we've just referred to? Number one, in your dealings with China, never take a backward step on adherence to universal human rights as defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. In other words, this is not an abstract thing. It's not just what the Americans think or what pops up out of a Republican focus group somewhere in Boise, Idaho. It's the UN Universal Declaration 1948, to which China is a signatory and a ratification state, something it's not moved away from post-49. And China, in fact, subsequently became a signatory state, though not yet a ratification state, to the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. So the key thing on the human rights question is anchoring the position we take with China on human rights in international law. And these are the two covenants which China has signed up to, not some abstraction in the back of our collective Western minds, if you know what I mean. And a quick point on the Charter itself. That is, the Universal Declaration, drafted in 1948 by Eleanor Roosevelt, but on her committee, senior Indian and Chinese officials at the time, reflecting other worldviews and other democratic and semi-democratic worldviews at the time. This was not just a Western invention, the 48 Convention. It would never pass today, for God's sake. The fact that we got it through in 48 is a minor miracle. But it's there, it's in the fabric of international law. Second principle is not applicable to Switzerland, which is neutral, but But for those of us who are allies of the United States, never take a backward step in saying we're allies of the United States. You know, for all the American predisposition for episodic craziness, look at Trump. How did that happen? Okay, that was a walk on the wild side for all of us. For those of us who are European and Asian allies of the United States, it's not just in our DNA, it's not just a question of identity, but it's also part of the stability of the post-45 global order. And so when the Chinese have said to me, and I've been Prime Minister, why the hell, Kevin, are you still an ally of the United States? Cold War's over, etc. I said, well, it may have interest to you, comrade, that the reason we're allies of the United States was that the Americans defended us against the Japanese in 1941. It had nothing to do with you. In fact, we were allies in the Second World War against Japan. But it is now so much part of the Australian DNA because of this combined wartime experience that it won't change. Principle number 3 is maximise your economic engagement with China to mutual economic advantage. These are principles for how you engage China today. Principle number 4, maximise our collaboration with China in the institutions of global governance, G20, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, other institutions, the World Bank, etc. Because China is so big and can be so constructive in the way in which they are engaged in these institutions, we should be maximising that. And number 5, if you're going to pick a fight with China, and you're not a superpower, the axiom I would apply is an inelegant one, but it would be like this: hunt in packs, don't be a lone wolf, because lone wolves will get boom. So if you're going to have a disagreement with China, as for example the Conservative government of Australia did most recently on calling unilaterally for a independent investigation of the origins of COVID in Wuhan in 2019-2020, something I fully support. But pragmatic diplomacy suggests you'd wait a week, get on the telephone, and you'd ring up another 20 or 30 democracies around the world and say, why don't we make this a joint démarche together, rather than just saying, well, I'm the Australian government, I'm just going to go out there and say this myself. And so that's $20 billion worth of tariff punishment later. So now against those 5 principles, who do I pick? Japan.
Interesting.
Japan has managed the complexity of its own historic relationship with China, applied those principles pretty robustly. The economic relationship is still strong. They still collaborate in institutional arrangements. Japan doesn't take a backward step on human rights, and certainly not on its alliance with the United States. And for example, whether it's with the Quad, where Australia, Japan, India, and the United States are together, or other institutions, is constantly, as it were, building collaborative partnerships with others in common positions to take in relation to China. So I think the Japanese have shown a lot of wisdom in how they've managed a complex relationship.
I want to move to audience questions pretty soon, so just a quick reminder that if you have a question, you can submit it. Yes, thank you very much. Oh yeah, there we go. Through that QR code on Slido, and then they show up here on that screen. But before we go there, sir, you said your answer was Japan, which makes a lot of sense to me. It's not Australia. It's also no European country, and it's not the EU. And I do want to talk about the EU because it seems to me, from the Chinese side, a lot of the strategy towards Europe sort of hinged on kind of separating the EU and the US and sort of treating them separately and sort of arguing towards the EU that the US's goals towards China were not necessarily the EU's goals of China. From the European side, on the other hand, there was this quite insightful paper, I think it came out in 2019 from the EU Commission, that famously treated China at the same time as a partner, as a competitor, and as a systemic rival. And I remember thinking at the time that this was an incredibly clever bit of diplomacy to say, you know, there's this country, and we don't want to decide whether they're a partner, a competitor, a systemic rival, so we just declare them to be all three at the same time. So I thought this is excellent, and I would have at the time pointed to the strategy as a really good example. And it seems it's gone horribly wrong. So you know, there's there's all these things that didn't work out. The comprehensive agreement on investment between the EU and China is on ice. There are sanctions from both sides against each other. So we can sort of switch sides now and look from the European perspective towards China. Why did this approach fail, or did it fail at all?
I think you're being a bit too hard on the Europeans.
Sorry about that.
And I'm not a European. So I'm just an Australian of English convict heritage. So we're just a bunch of failed criminals down there. I thought the European strategy of 2019 wasn't bad, because it actually tried to straddle the same complex reality that I was describing before in my 5 principles. And given where Brussels had been before on these questions, which is somewhere between marshmallow and tofu in terms of its strategic centre of gravity, like nowhere really, I thought this was a much more robust framework than what Brussels had had before. Remember, the historical European position has been as follows. I don't mean Switzerland here, I mean Brussels when I say European. Is China equals big economic market, tick. China equals security problem, only for the Americans in Asia and the Pacific, tick. 3, China equals a human rights problem for us, let's have a seminar. And that, I think, was my distillation of where the Euros were before 2019. So I actually see the European document of 2019 as actually a systemic improvement of where the real European reflection on China's current Xi Jinping reality now lay. Now, obviously, since then, look at the operationalization of that. It's because of their 3rd pillar on human rights over Xinjiang and China's reaction to that, and that the pillar number 1 on the economy, which is the free trade agreement between Brussels and Beijing, was torpedoed because the Chinese objected to the position taken by various members of the European Parliament. The Chinese were shocked that the Europeans did this, because the Chinese view of Europe still is that it really is a bowl of strategic marshmallow. So therefore, this is quite a surprising development. NATO, not the European Union, but you know the common memberships are large, adopting now a framework which explicitly embraces the China challenge as part of its rolling summit level, ministerial level, and frankly operational command level engagements. Why? Not just because the Chinese are now actively strategically collaborating with the Russians, which they are, but also China in terms of its own, even its naval operations. When you've got Chinese naval exercises in the Baltic, what are the Chinese doing in the Baltic, for God's sake? Mediterranean, not often, but together with the Russians. But thirdly, cyber knows no geography. And so when you've got cyber attacks either against Credit Suisse or against a European institution or against the Commission in Brussels or against anywhere else, geography in this cyber world ultimately collapses. And so that's why I think you see NATO now fully embraced. So I'm less critical of you Europeans or those 2 institutions than perhaps you are.
I want to get some audience questions now, and there's the one question that pops up here on the top, which means is the one that most people want answered, is one that I actually know that you've been asked quite a few times already, but it makes sense because it's an important one, and it goes like this. Have the Russian difficulties in Ukraine possibly delayed or even prevented Beijing's plans on attempting to retake Taiwan? Has the strategic calculus from Beijing on Taiwan changed as a result of Russia's, not sure if we can yet say failed invasion of Ukraine, but because of Russia's difficulties in successfully invading Ukraine?
Yeah, I'm glad you added the caveat, because we've got to be very cautious about reaching early conclusions on Ukraine. Donbass is a mess, and those of us who follow it closely both in what happened in Donetsk and Luhansk in 2014, as well as Crimea, and now what is happening in the battlefield now. Putin's strategy is clear, which is take Donbass, link it with a land corridor through to Crimea, freeze the conflict, applying the model which was used with Georgia back in 2006-07 over Ossetia, and then roll the clock on another 10 years and see what we do then. And would that be sufficient de minima declaration of victory back in Moscow, given the nature of the Moscow state-controlled media? Possibly. So I think we need to suspend judgment. I mean, I think Plan A for Putin's been a comprehensive defeat, which is to crush Kiev within a week and take the country. But Plan B is still, I think, deeply in play. And while I'm not a Ukraine expert at all, certainly not a Russia expert, I'm very cautious about what will happen on the ground there. And remember, the Chinese and Russian view is that everyone's outraged about Ukraine now. They regard European political opinion as fickle, and the Chinese use this term, and Europe next year will suffer from strategic amnesia about Ukraine, and it'll be back to business as usual. So we need to be very cautious about reaching judgments about where this will finally land. But full marks to the Ukrainians and President Zelensky for this extraordinary act of national resilience in the face of this onslaught. So, answer to your question then, having given the caveat, is no, it doesn't change Chinese timetabling on Taiwan at all. That may seem counterintuitive, but my judgment is, and the analytical community that I deal with in the United States on these questions, is that Xi Jinping's preferred timetable for Taiwan is more likely to be late 20s and early 30s, and it has been that way for quite some time. A, they want to have a much more decisive balance of military power against the Americans and the Taiwanese, which they don't yet have. They have an advantage now, but not a decisive advantage. And B, they want to move in that direction against that timetable when they are both financially and economically more resilient, bigger, more resilient, more dominant in the world than they are now. And so I don't think either of those calculus change because of Putin's difficulties in the field in Ukraine. In fact, the Chinese would say to the Russians, you should have been better prepared. And that's what we're in the process of doing.
If I can ask a follow-up question, so there's the military dimension, but there seems to me also the dimension of the unified response from much of the global community and certainly the West to the Russian invasion. Is that giving the strategists in Beijing pause? Is that something they would have expected? Because that's likely what they would have to expect if they decided to invade Taiwan.
Yeah, I think the Chinese are deeply realist. And so their wargaming would have been in relation to Taiwan whenever it happens, would have been along these lines. There will be a replication of the sorts of sanctions and financial and economic that were imposed on China after Tiananmen between 89 and 92. And then they conclude, and by the time we got to 1992, the West forgot about Tiananmen, and that was that. That's very much the soft learning in the deep learning, if you like, in Chinese observation of Western political behaviour. I think it would be fair to say that both the Russians and the Chinese were surprised by the level of European political unity. But they'll be looking now at where all the fractures are emerging. Look at the most recent election in the Länder in Germany, and the critique that Olaf Scholz has come under in terms of the provision of military equipment to the Ukrainians. And the Chinese and the Russian position will be these fault lines will re-emerge. But I think in the first phase, you're right, Nico, they were quite surprised by the level of European unity. But let's be realistic about this. Had Kiev fallen in the first 3 days, I'm not sure there would have been a whole lot of unity after that. So I think it's because of what Zelensky and the Ukrainians were able to pull off in the field that made the material difference in Europe as well.
Let me move on to an entirely different topic, but one that I think hasn't come up yet tonight and is interesting. So China has had for obviously a very long time a one-child policy. They've lifted this, but the demographic projections for China are not good. And it's commonly believed that that may create economic problems down the road quite soon, because there's just not the population to sustain the growth that the country has seen and that the country needs. How does that factor in to the thinking? So you've talked about sort of an ideological shift. You talked about common prosperity, a more equal distribution of wealth, but certainly this demographic time bomb, if we can call it that, must be on the minds of Chinese economic policymakers. How are they responding to that, and how do you think will they want to respond to that in the future?
Yeah, this is a really important question, Nico, because it goes to China's long-term economic strength, power and resilience. What are the three drivers of long-term economic growth? They are population, workforce participation and productivity. In Australia we call them the three Ps. So population is been aging for a long period of time, but will probably peak around about 2026 at around not far above 1.4 billion. India will soon take over, if not around about now. The demographers are not fully agreed on this. Two, which is a fascinating question in terms of where India under Modi now goes, and that's a separate bucket of complexity. But the number two is workforce participation. Chinese workforce peaked in 2014 in size. Some say, well, you increase the workforce by throwing open the age limitations for retirement, and I think the Chinese will do that. But a lot of people above retirement age in China are working already in the informal workforce. So I'm not sure, the analysts who look at this very carefully are not sure this will alter the dial a whole lot. Then, of course, parents provide all this childcare as well in the Chinese system. Third, productivity growth. It's been bumping along the ground at about 1% now in the Xi Jinping period, whereas prior to that, productivity growth was basically ticking up at around about 3% for most of the first decade of this century. So what have you got in aggregate? Declining productivity growth, declining workforce participation, and declining population growth with an aging population. This creates a problem. As the Chinese have often said internally, we don't want to become old before we become really rich. And that's kind of a lesson for life, isn't it? But anyway, so therefore, this looms large. So what are the counter policies? Of course, they've got rid of the one-child policy, and then they basically said, now you can have as many kids as you like. Really interesting observation, though, is at two levels, one of economics and one of sociology. On the economics, folks are saying in China, it's still too expensive to have more than one kid. Cost of childcare is huge, and with the one-child policy, guess what? It gets hard to ensure that you're going to have adequate family-based childcare available to you. And secondly, to put it indelicately, Chinese women are conducting a sex strike because it's such a misogynist set of arrangements there. And so the natural birth rate is around about 1.63, am I correct? And it's quite low. And so therefore, in a society where, look, for example, how many Chinese corporations do you know? How many women head those corporations? Look at the Chinese Politburo. How many women members are there in the Politburo? I'll tell you, there are 2 out of 25. How many women members are there of the Standing Committee of the Politburo? 0. How many women members are of the Central Committee, made up of 220 members? 25, maybe. So there is a deep misogyny in the current prevailing political culture against these objective measures. Applied to the workplace, modern, educated Chinese women are kind of fed up. And you see similar patterns, of course, in Japan and the Republic of Korea. It's just come much earlier in China in terms of the stage of economic development. So therefore, we have a population problem. Women making their own life choices. And then there's, for those who are in family life right now, having more than one kid is just not easy unless you are part of a narrow elite. There was a report recently, by the way, to the party, all 95 million members, which is, we expect party members to have 3 kids each. Well, that's going to be interesting to enforce, you know. I wouldn't put it past them, but it's pretty interesting to enforce that as a piece of party discipline.
Another question that I think a lot of people would like to see answered, not just in this room, but much more generally. And the question is more subtly phrased. I'm paraphrasing here a little bit. Like, what's your best prediction? How and when will the pandemic end in China?
I could make a lot of money on that if I knew. Well, A, as you know, Nico, we don't know the answer to that globally. And B, if I could redefine the question slightly by putting it in terms of when will China's current policy of zero tolerance end in dealing with the current variants which are alive in China. Let's call it Omicron plus. My baseline prediction is that nothing will change of any consequence between now and the 20th Party Congress in November at all, because we're in a no-risk environment. The leader, Xi Jinping, has decreed China has a successful zero-COVID strategy. The leader can never be wrong. Therefore, I should have had that when I was Prime Minister, I'd still be there. The leader can never be wrong, and as a consequence of that, long live the leader. So it won't change until Xi Jinping is reappointed, based on my assumption that he's 75% probability of being reappointed in November. Then you will have no public declaration ever that the policy has changed. It will then, quote, cease to be operationalised, in my view. And how will that occur without creating a public brouhaha? They will cease testing. No testing, no data, therefore no virus.
And how will they justify stopping the testing?
It's just one of those things that just drifts away. I'm putting my mind into the position of a mid to high level Chinese cadre saying, oh my God, what are we going to do after November? This is my best prediction about where it will drift to. Of course, the liability in the Chinese system, because their domestic vaccine is largely ineffective, despite having been provided with mRNA vaccines, for ideological reasons, the leader can never be wrong, we're not using them. Old people are still ineffectively, when I say old people, people as old as me, are not properly vaccinated. So the conundrum is, if there are further breakouts and we still see mortality rates among over 65s, even in the absence of testing, then there is a potential problem for them on that score. So what I can't wargame in my mind is what will happen between now and then with mRNA vaccine regimes for older Chinese in order to put older people in a more secure position as they are in the rest of the world at the moment, where vaccinations have occurred and boosters have been administered. In other words, it lessens the impact of the virus on you.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up question on COVID, because it's something I've wondered about myself. Why is it that China hasn't been able to effectively vaccinate its older population? Setting aside for a moment the effectiveness of the vaccines, but it also seems like there's just the vaccination rate among older Chinese people is just very, very low compared to other countries and compared to the country's own overall vaccination rate. And it seems like if, as a bureaucracy, you're able to mass test everybody all the time and to lock entire cities down, you should be able to enforce vaccination. Why has that not worked?
It's an excellent question. I think the answer to it is, let's look at Hong Kong. Vaccination rates among old people in Hong Kong are also very low. So there's something of a cultural factor here as well, which is, yes, they could enforce it, but do you really want a lot of social media footage of Grandma Wang being held to the floor and being jabbed? Probably not. Even the Communist Party regard that as a bad piece of news.
But doesn't the Communist Party control social media? Could they not just censor all of that?
Well, it's a quantitative challenge with social media. It's like stuff is bubbling up every day and right across China protesting about the impact of the lockdown. And as soon as you take it down, which the Chinese Communist Party does, it just pops up again. So it's like playing permanent whack-a-mole, you know. That's an American game, but I whack-a-mole. So, you know, boom, boop, boom, boop. That's kind of how it's going at the moment. So, and even if it's just screenshot for the 10 seconds that it's there, that itself gets around. So, but what's the cultural factor at play here? Older people in the Chinese-speaking world are generally distrustful of governments. And certainly governments sticking stuff into your arm in Chinese society. Now, this is a gross generalization from me. I'm obviously Caucasian, I'm not Chinese. But when I have asked the same question you've asked, Nico, as to why isn't this happening? Well, they just don't trust the system. Even in Hong Kong, they don't trust the system. And even though in Hong Kong there are a variety of vaccines on offer, as opposed to China, where you get the Chinese equivalent of Sputnik, and before you take off into space with it, I presume. So I think for those reasons, you've got this deep reluctance. I think it would change if they brought in the mRNA vaccines. And there's enough literature, you know, in social media and on the internet, and retired Chinese read the internet all the time, from Chinese-speaking communities in the United States saying, we haven't died yet and we got vaccinated, you know. So I think that's part of the factor.
I want to ask one last question from the audience, and that question is about Switzerland. We are, of course, in Switzerland. We haven't really spoken about Switzerland in that whole context yet. So as you know,
Confederazione Helvetia, right? Yeah.
As you know, Switzerland likes to say that we have a special relationship with China. We were the first country to diplomatically recognize the PRC. We're still the only country in continental Europe.
Did you do that in 1949, did you?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Because I thought it was quick.
Sometimes we're quick. We were also quick to sign a free trade agreement with China in 2013. I think it was signed, and in 2014 came into existence. So I think Switzerland, with some reason for a long time, has argued that it was, while obviously much smaller, economically much less significant country than China, that there was this kind of special relationship. There was this argument that China would see Switzerland in a way kind of as a testing ground for things that it could then do economically with the rest of Europe. Can you qualify this judgment from a Chinese point of view? Do you have any insight into how China sees Switzerland or sees countries like Switzerland?
Yeah, I think well, firstly, on Switzerland's own circumstances, as we said in an earlier gathering today, I'm reasonably familiar with the origins of Swiss neutrality. I'm a student of history, and I understand how all this emerged. And as I confessed in an earlier gathering today, I've just finished reading a biography of Zwingli. So he did some crazy things here in Zurich. But we all did back then. So So the origins of, the Confederates coming together within the Confederation, previously independent states, and eventually the evolution of this concept of Swiss neutrality. And I get its origins and the challenges that you faced in World War II when it was on again, off again in Hitler's mind about whether to move in here. So, it's you have a complex security policy history and a foreign policy history, but I have some familiarity with it. And it's for those reasons, of course, you have so many international institutions here, including the UN. So all that's to the good. When China in the pre-Xi Jinping period was a country we all engaged around the world without huge question marks, then we would all have claimed to have had special relationships. A number of times I've heard the Chinese say, well, the great thing about Australia, we've got a special relationship with you guys. And
you seem to say that to everyone.
Yeah, that's right. Liechtenstein's special relationship. Except the Yanks, they've never had a special relationship with the Americans. That's always been a problem, either capital P or small p problem. So I don't think we should be too flattered by our special relationship status with the Chinese. I think we're all, in the Chinese vernacular, 老朋友, old friends. I think when I listen to Chinese domestically about their views of Europe, they think first and foremost of Germany because they regard Germany as remarkably successful, given what happened in the Second World War, the rebuilding of German manufacturing, Germany now being obviously, since the British shot themselves in the foot by withdrawing from the European Union. Boy, that was one of the dumbest things I've ever seen. From a British national interest point of view, I mean, Britain was always more powerful by being in Europe, and Europe was always more powerful by having Britain in it. So you line up both your feet and you blow a hole in both feet. Well, thank you, Boris. But given what Britain has done, I mean, Germany is now the dominant power in Europe. That's just the reality. European politicians will never say that. I'm a visiting Australian. I can say that. And that secondly, where Brussels goes, the view in Berlin is overwhelmingly important, not just for the European Central Bank, but of course the Commission itself. So there is a huge preoccupation in Beijing with Berlin. That's just the truth of it. Therefore, the German view of how to engage China in the future will be scrutinized intimately by the Chinese system. Hence why, to go back to one of your earlier questions, Nico, the Chinese would have been not so much shocked by European solidarity over Ukraine, but seriously shocked by Olaf Scholz, a Social Democrat, undertaking a 180-degree shift on German security policy following the Russian invasion of Ukraine on German defence outlays, the provision of military equipment and the rest. That, I think, is surprising in the Chinese mind. For Switzerland, part of the due respect to Geneva and due respect to the Italian-speaking parts, the German-speaking lands in Switzerland, they have a wider view that this country is also extraordinarily and robustly successful. You've managed to retain global agricultural exports. You still export manufacturers, and you're obviously a financial services sector of global consequence, major global consequence. So the Chinese have a deep respect for that when they look at this country. But on the final part of your question really is that, by implication, what are the future for all of us in this new China we are dealing with? Xi Jinping has changed China. That's my core argument to this group. The China of 2014 is vastly different from the China of 2022. The China of 2014 was quite similar to the China of 2004 and the China of 1994. China under Deng, Zhang and Hu, really from 1978 to 2014-17, was an evolving continuity. There is now a discontinuity for the reasons of Xi Jinping's worldview, taking politics in China further to the left, taking the centre of gravity of economic policy in China further to the left, and taking Chinese nationalism to the right with a much more assertive foreign and security policy. So for whether it's the government in Bern or the business community here in Zurich, for all of us, Canberra or Sydney, and political and economic communities in the democracies of the world, in Asia and Europe today, everyone's wrestling with exactly this same conundrum. What are the future of our special relationships? And my only counsel in looking at the future is the 5 principles I outlined earlier on, which I think are the better guides for framing a balanced China strategy given the new complexity around human rights, relationship with the United States, different in Switzerland's case, maximum economic engagement with China, maximum collaboration in global institutions, but whether they're seeking to change the global institutions, pushing back hard, because that conflicts with human rights, principle number 1. And 5, hunt in packs. So
I think hunting in packs is a great place to end this conversation. So, Kang-Bin, thank you very, very much for having been here and for all your insight. We could continue, of course, a long time, but we're going to leave it here. Thank you again very much for having been here.